Yeah, sure. Well, I think for your audience, Bob, it's fair to say that most people appreciate the fact that fiat money issuing central banks can create all the funding they need to make all the loans they need or buy all the assets that they need. And they don't have to, as it were, go around hat in hand and borrow from anybody in order to be able to accumulate assets to make their balance sheets grow. And as you mentioned, QE certainly represents for all of us very starkly the capacity of central banks to acquire assets using nothing but their printing presses, as it were. Now, the theory I'm going after, quixotically, as you say, appropriately enough now that I'm in Spain, that theory holds that ordinary banks, that is every commercial bank, that the kinds of banks that you and I deal with, have the same capacity. That is, they essentially can create their own funding out of thin air. And that's all they need to do is to use their money-creating powers to engage in as much lending as they like. So every bank is put on the same footing by this theory as most people would agree central banks are on. And I think that's the argument that there's no difference is completely false. And my paper aims to show why what central banks can do isn't something ordinary banks can do. They really do have to borrow from other people, borrow real savings from other people for the most part, in order to be able to acquire assets and make loans. They can't just write their way into all of the assets that they would like to acquire.
Okay, and so why don't we, before we start getting into the particulars, so I think the listener now understands the big picture, at least of what we're talking about, but then they might say, why do I want to spend an hour listening to this? So can you give them a commercial? Like, why should they care?
Yes, well, the reason your listeners should care is we often see occasions when too much money creation goes on and inflation results. And it's important to understand where the problem lies. Where does responsibility for this kind of thing belong? If, in fact, every commercial bank has the same money creation powers, or I should say lending powers, as a central bank does, in our case, in the United States case, I should say, if every bank is just as capable of contributing to arbitrarily to asset acquisition and expansion of credit as the central bank is, then, of course, in any inflationary process, they should be as suspect as the Fed. Whereas if I'm correct, the Fed is suspect number one. Its powers of excess credit creation are far vaster than those of ordinary banks. And indeed, most of the time when ordinary banks are engaging in too much credit creation, and they do engage in too much credit creation sometimes, it's only because they're being enabled to do so by the reserve creating activities of their central bank, which is really the ultimate cause of trouble. So that's I think the most obvious policy implication that comes from taking my point of view, as opposed to the other point of view that said, look, even if your central bank is doing everything it can to not have credit grow excessively, the commercial banks, those bad commercial banks, can do it all by themselves. So it's really a problem that the central bank isn't responsible for and may not even be able to prevent. That's what comes from the other theory.
Okay, let me just push on that one more. So, because that was partly when I read, your paper very carefully, and then I at least skimmed the Jakov and Kumov. Is that how we're pronouncing their names?
That's how I pronounce them, yeah.
So I'll follow your lead. I think, you listed in your paper, like, here's some representatives of what you were calling the thin air theory, just to contrast with your approach. And yeah, I agree that I can understand why their paper is lauded by that camp as, hey, look how rigorous this is. They got a nice internally consistent mathematical model, with all the superscripts and subscripts and so it's very impressive.
Empirical tests.
Yeah, right. Yeah. So they do everything you'd want in terms of a modern scientific economics paper where they have a model, they solve the equilibrium, and they run through here's some shocks, and they do different shocks, and then they look against the actual data, the stylized facts of how modern economies work, and it looks like their approach, their model better matches the data than the rival model. And why don't I go ahead and just say
That's
right
what
now?
They claim.
So they're in their framework, they're contrasting what they call the ILF approach, which stands for intermediary or intermediation of loanable funds. And so that's like the old school people, they think, where banks are basically like just, savers are hoarding cans of tuna fish and kerosene. They give it to this thing called a bank, and then it lends it out to businesses. And that's what and I'm exaggerating a little bit, folks, but I'm not full. Like they really do.
Not that much.
And their papers say the people we're attacking implicitly are relying on banks as physical warehouses. And then they're contrasting with what they call the FMC approach, which is financing through money creation. Okay. And again, just to finish the train of thought, they solve for the two types of models. And they say, look, in our model, there's bigger swings in bank balance sheets, due to particular shocks. And that's what we actually see in the real world, that in terms of like savers' preferences being tweaked with consumption smoothing over time. The old school model, the ILF model, where banks are just pure intermediaries between actual household saving and business borrowers, you wouldn't see these wild swings the way you do in the real world in a typical business cycle. So that's why they think their model's more rigorous and empirical. So anyway, just to circle back, what I was getting at, George, I didn't see in their particular paper, it looked like they were just laying out the framework, and then in the conclusion, it was sort of like, we think this is a more fruitful approach that better matches the data, and we leave it to others to go do something with this. Like they didn't actually say the ILF people have this policy conclusion, whereas we have this.
That's right.
So you're saying that, but no, you have seen some people, or they might even say, if you're worried about inflation, trying to get Powell to raise rates, that's stupid. What are you even looking? That's not even where it's coming from. Is that kind of the rhetorical move they make?
Well, so two things. First of all, plenty of people who subscribe to this view that banks aren't intermediaries, that they can create all the funding they need with a keystroke. That they do, many of them do essentially claim that the banks have the same powers. They are claiming that the banks have the same powers of money creation as a central bank, and some of them go further and explicitly say the central bank doesn't have much ability to control how much money creation and credit granting goes on. Now, in the Kumhoff and Jacob paper, I should say Jacob and Kumhoff, Jacob's the principal first author, they don't state that policy conclusion, but it's absolutely implied by their arguments. Absolutely implied. There's no way around it. If their theory is correct, there is nothing except some regulatory barriers to limit credit expansion. So, you can limit credit expansion by the private banks if you impose all kinds of restrictions on them. They can be capital restrictions. They can be legal reserve requirements. But merely restricting the availability of reserves, which is the stuff the central banks create, that doesn't do it. Because essentially, their story says that the banks don't have to have any reserves unless they're forced to in order to engage in all the funding, all the lending that they want to. So if I'm attributing or drawing policy conclusions, which I claim are the conclusions of this theory, what I mean is either the proponents of the theory say so explicitly, as some do, or it's simply implied by their arguments, as in some other cases. But it's there. It's very much there. And this is important because we've moved to a world where now in the United States, as well as elsewhere, there are no statutory reserve requirements. So if those are necessary to tie down the ordinary banks and their money-creating activities, then we're that much closer to being in a world where those activities aren't really tied down much at all. As I insist, all of this is quite false. By the way, I think it's obviously false to many people. The problem is that we have a theory here that says otherwise. I should say I've had two responses to my pushing back against this view that banks aren't intermediaries, and they're diametrically opposed. So I mentioned them. One says, oh, this is just a semantic quibble. Those people aren't really saying anything different than you are, so you're wasting your time. The other group says, I must be making up this other theory because surely nobody would say anything like that.
Yeah, right.
And these are irreconcilable. The only thing they all agree on is that I'm wasting my time. But in fact, though,
well, I suppose, George, theoretically, you could reconcile those if the person said, no, you guys are saying the same thing and you're both nuts.
Yeah, but I think that, I don't think we're saying the same thing. I think we're saying some substantively different things. This is a real debate about what real resources ordinary banks required in order to engage in the granting of credit, and whether those requirements are substantially different from what a central bank with fiat money creating powers faces. So that's the substantive debate here. And even if you don't think the policy implications are that important, let's say you believe that we have enough restrictions on commercial banks that even though they don't need reserves to make loans, we can force them to restrict their lending in other ways besides reserve scarcity. It's still very important to understand correctly just what it takes for banks to make loans or not be able to make loans for all kinds of reasons, and why that is, how that their powers do or do not differ from those of central banks.